Today the companion application gets its first runnable multi-tenant boundary. One user identity receives a token for tenant A and later a token for tenant B. The first token creates a work item. The second token cannot list, edit, request a report for, or read a report from tenant A, even though both tokens name the same user. A background job given the wrong tenant identifier cannot load or complete another tenant's report. We will connect server-generated membership, a scope tenant context, core query filters, a composite foreign key, hangfire arguments, and a safe legacy data migration. This is a focused first boundary, not a claim that every feature is tenant isolated. A tenant is an organization, workspace, or customer data boundary. It is not the same thing as a user. A user identifier answers who is acting, a tenant identifier answers which data space that action belongs to. Owner checks can still matter inside a tenant, but owner ID alone does not protect a person who can act in more than one tenant. The smallest useful model is a trusted tenant membership claim flowing into one scope tenant context. Database queries read that context automatically, entities store tenant ID explicitly, relationships include it, and background work restores it before querying. If the tenant cannot be established unambiguously, the feature must stop rather than guess. FeatureLab user now stores tenant ID. Its server-side default provisions a fresh personal workspace when the companion registration flow constructs a new user. The request body never supplies that value. During sign-in, FeatureLab user claims principal factory reads the stored membership and adds tenant_ID to the authenticated identity only when the GID is non-empty. That makes the token a server-issued snapshot instead of trusting an arbitrary header, root value, or form field. This one tenant per user model keeps the first slice understandable. A real invitation flow would assign membership deliberately. Existing bearer tokens also keep their old claims, so tenant reassignment needs short lifetimes, refresh or revocation. This episode treats membership as immutable outside its isolation test. Tenant membership does not take the first matching claim. It requires exactly one tenant_ID, parses it as a GID, and rejects GID empty. Missing, malformed, empty, or duplicate values therefore fail closed. The work item root group requires the tenant member policy, so an authenticated principal without unambiguous membership receives forbidden. Between authentication and authorization, middleware repeats the safe parse and sets the scoped tenant context. Its ID throws when no tenant was established, and set rejects an empty value or an attempt to change tenants in the same dependency injection scope. That ordering gives authorization and core one consistent value for the whole request. Work item and work item report each gain a required tenant ID. Creation methods reject GID empty, and endpoints pass tenant.id from the scoped context rather than accepting tenant input from the client. Work item store also refuses an entity whose tenant ID differs from the current scope. The report service stamps that same context value when it records pending work. Owner ID remains useful because a tenant may contain many members and this feature stays owner-scoped within its tenant. Persisting tenant ID makes the boundary durable after the request ends and supports constraints plus background work. The public response does not expose tenant ID merely because the database stores it. FeatureLab DB context receives iTenant context and exposes current tenant ID as an instance property. global filters for work item and work item report compare every row with that value, so ordinary queries stay inside the current context instance. This detail matters. The model must not freeze a startup tenant or use a mutable global value shared by requests. Filtering protects ordinary reads, while the relationship adds write integrity. Work item has an alternate key over tenant ID, and work item report uses tenant ID plus work item ID as its foreign key. A report therefore cannot point at a work item through a cross-tenant relationship, even if application code makes a mistake. There is no authenticated HTTP principal when Hangfire later runs the report job. The trusted enqueue path therefore records both tenant ID and report ID as small serializable arguments. Work item report job receives a fresh scope tenant context, sets it before the report service queries EF core, and then uses the same filters as a web request. If the tenant and report do not match, the filtered lookup finds nothing and generation throws. It does not silently switch tenants. Tenant ID is a scope key, not a secret, so only trusted server code should include this command. The existing bounded retry and idempotent completion behavior remain, now inside an explicit tenant boundary. The strongest integration test avoids an easy false positive. It registers one account, assigns tenant A, issues token A, reassigns that same user record to tenant B, and issues token B. Both tokens carry the same user identifier while their tenant_ID claims differ. Token A creates a work item. Token B cannot list, update, request a report for, or read tenant A resources. The create JSON even includes a forged tenant ID and the server ignores it. Another test runs a report job with the wrong tenant and confirms the correct tenant still sees pending. 3 migration tests cover an empty database, a populated upgrade, and an unmappable legacy owner. The complete release suite now passes 44 tests. Required columns need a transition plan. The first migration adds tenant ID and the parent key. A separate data migration generates a personal workspace for every existing identity user, maps work items through their stored owner ID, and maps reports through their work item. A temporary check guard aborts the migration if an owner or relationship cannot be mapped, rather than hiding unknown rows or guessing. Only the final migration installs the composite report foreign key. Tests seed the episode 9 schema, preserve the RAW mapping, require non-empty matching tenant IDs, and run SQLite foreign key checks. This backfill is specific to the companion's owner model. Real products need reviewed business mapping. Global filters are still defense in depth. Ignore query filters, raw SQL, or another data path can bypass them and require explicit authorization plus review. We generated featurelab user.tenantID on the server, emitted one tenant_ID claim, rejected ambiguous membership, established an immutable request scope, stamped protected rows, applied context instance EF core filters, protected report relationships with a composite foreign key, carried tenant plus report identifiers into hangfire, and upgraded mapped legacy rows before enforcement. 44 tests prove request, database, migration, and job boundaries. Be precise about the result. SignalRChat remains a shared authenticated lobby outside this slice, so the application is not fully tenant isolated. A future slice should give chat tenant groups and tenant stamped messages, followed by deliberate invitation, membership, token revocation, and administration workflows.